So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dave Watson as our first speaker to make his case, and I'm going to time him. So keep it to time, said Tommy. That's your job. So, Dave,
okay.
Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Kate. What I'm going to do essentially is set out, hopefully, to set the scene as to where I think we are, and some of the work that certainly Unison's been doing around this issue, and perhaps that will set the scene for the discussion. I think obviously we start with the fact that we had a referendum and we had a referendum outcome, and I think Unison and I think the Labour Party, and certainly myself, I think start from the position that even though we campaigned for a Remain vote, that we have to respect that decision. So we haven't signed up for the numerous campaigns that are doing the rounds in Scotland at the moment, for example, for a second referendum, or those, for example, campaigns like remaining in the single market campaigns, of which have political as well as policy implications. So we start with the position that we're coming out of Europe, certainly out of the European Union. And therefore, once that decision's been taken, you're essentially, the first big issue is then the negotiations for the withdrawal. And what is often called Brexit negotiations, probably more accurately EU exit negotiations. Now, we know that in December, the UK government reached an interim agreement with the EU, the EU Commission, in relation to some initial issues, like, for example, the status of existing EU nationals living within the UK. They also reached, we don't know exactly how, but some deal around funding, a recognition that the UK would have to make a contribution, an exit divorce bill, as it's sometimes described. I always thought the infamous bus was about us getting money back from them rather than the other way, but obviously I haven't understood these things properly. That we're apparently going to pay them billions of pounds. So that's where we are. What I think we have to understand is that was intended to get into the second phase of negotiations. Issues even within those few headlines, like, for example, the issue of the Northern Ireland border with the Republic, were left very, very vague indeed. Sort of commitment to achieve a frictionless border without any real understanding as to how that was going to be achieved. So that got them to the second stage, and then that was supposed to mean a year of intense negotiations up to when we actually come out of the EU next year. But very quickly it was obvious that the UK government was ill prepared for those negotiations. I often think when you listen to UK government ministers that they would benefit from going on a Unison shop stewards course to teach them how to negotiate, because all the mistakes, I mean, frankly, if it was one of my branches had described their negotiation strategy, I would be past the building language and the encouragement stage, and I'd be at the what the fuck stage at this stage of one of my branches in terms of that type of negotiation. So that's where we are. So the result of all that is that instead of having a 2-year implementation period for the agreement, we've essentially got 2 more years of negotiation on top of whatever's left of this year as well. So none of that's going to move terribly fast either. The UK government has, under some pressure, published its own impact assessments. You can make what you want of them. They seem to me to be pretty light. I'm a lawyer, not an economist, but it certainly seems to me that a lot of people are publishing economic models. The strength of many of them, I think, is at least doubtful. Largely because no one's really been in this position before, and it's therefore very difficult to build in the normal assumptions you would to those models. But nonetheless, it's been published. We've also had the EU, which has been generally pretty upfront with what it wants at each stage. It's published its positions. I thought, for example, the EU's positions on migration were pretty sensible, and frankly should have been grabbed by the UK government, but they weren't. They've now published a more detailed withdrawal agreement, some of the things I agree with, some I don't, but nonetheless, I think it illustrates the fact that they've got their side together, they've got a clear negotiating strategy, something that we haven't on our side of it. The Brexit War Cabinet has met and decided its strategy, apparently. And that is in that we're not staying in the customs union and not in the single market. Now, the fine point of Brexit is all around whether it's about a customs union or the customs union or a single market or the single market. Some of you might think this is a difference without a distinction, but as others have said, but nonetheless there are important nuances apparently within that. Jeremy Corbyn's made his position as clear as I think he needs to at this stage of the process. Obviously, we've had Keir Starmer's 6 infamous tests in relation to what Labour will or will not vote for in terms of the EU withdrawal bill. And then we have Jeremy's speech, which essentially said that he would support a customs union, essentially frictionless trade, but he had reservations about the single market and particularly talked about a strong relationship with the single market. Now, obviously where we are, my own view is that, and Unison broadly welcomed that speech. We haven't said that we have to stay in the customs union or the single market. We're certainly in favour of frictionless trade, but certainly in relation to the single market, we have reservations. So I think those are the sort of areas of difference. Areas of problems we have with the single market. I'll touch on those in a minute. Then you get into the issue of devolution. And as you know, there's another set of negotiations. That's between the UK government and the Scottish government and the Welsh government, and that's in an attempt to reach agreement. Now, the reason that there's an issue there is that under the Scotland Act and under the Wales Act, that essentially there are powers which are already devolved to those parliaments, and that includes in certainly Scotland's case, that includes a number of the areas of responsibility for which there are additional powers coming to us or coming to the UK in relation to Europe. The principle of that is the difference between the two governments is that the UK government agrees that most of those will go directly to the Scottish Parliament, but it thinks probably around 20 it wants to hold back to negotiate framework agreements so there are common UK arrangements on those issues. Now, the Scottish Parliament's position, this is pretty much a cross-party position, even a lot of the Tories broadly accept this position, which is that essentially the power should come to the Scottish Parliament and then you negotiate rather than being held at the centre and passed down. And the principle behind that is what's often known as the juror amendment. For those of you who remember back in the late 90s when these things were being negotiated, Donald put in very much the last stage in the Scotland Act, a provision that everything is devolved to the Scottish Parliament except those matters which are specifically reserved in Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act 1998. So on that basis, and we're very supportive of that position, the Scottish Government has tried to protect that position by publishing its own continuity bill, as it's known, technically EU withdrawal brackets continuity Scotland bill, but it's essentially doing that. So the UK government's got the option of passing its bill without the Scottish and Welsh bits and then leaving it to those parliaments to do so. There are some difficulties in relation to that. The Welsh Parliament's presiding officer is reasonably comfortable with the Welsh bill. The Scottish Parliament's presiding officer is not comfortable with the Scottish bill. The Scottish law officers are, but the presiding officer isn't. I have to say I'm somewhat cynical around this. Some of us might remember the trade union bill that was going through the UK Parliament, and I concocted along with a number of other colleagues a way for the Scottish Parliament to get past that, but Scottish Government wasn't quite as keen as going to war over the trade union bill as it appears to be over the continuity bill, but that's just me being cynical. Anyway, we are now apparently threatened with the Supreme Court, and Theresa May is going to trek down, just cross over Parliament Square and seek to get that bill or block royal assent for that piece of legislation. The Scottish Government takes a pretty gung-ho view in favour of keeping as close to Europe as it can in these negotiations. It's in favour of the customs union and the single market. It's published a thing called the Single Market Study, which has lots of the same economic models, which tells us it's all doom and gloom when we leave. It may well be, but again, yeah, I think you do have to question some of the economic models. The other thing which, frankly, I think we have great difficulty with is that it's gushing about aspects of Europe that we've been pretty critical of. For example, they think the Services Directive is wonderful and is going to create major economic opportunities. Frankly, I remember campaigning against the Services Directive, certainly Unison did. And whilst we got many changes to it, I'm bound to say I don't see that as some glorious economic hope for Scotland. Equally, the Scottish Government talks about social Europe. I thought social Europe died with the Lisbon Treaty, but obviously I'm wrong. That's essentially it. To be honest, an overly gushing defence of the single market. I mean, Unison, lastly, I suppose Unison's focus has been on the issues that matter to our members. First and foremost, obviously, we are concerned about the economic impact. That's not just a Unison concern, but obviously other trade unions have similar concerns about economic dislocation, the damage in relation to trade, jobs being moved around Europe. Bear in mind that in manufacturing, the complexity of manufacturing processes these days when parts are moved around Europe. And obviously there are concerns about jobs drifting into Europe if we don't have proper customs arrangements and some elements of single market. Unison's probably big focus, however, has been on migration. Our first job of trade union is to protect its members, and we have about 5,000 EU national members in Scotland, about 60,000 across the UK. So our first job is to protect them. There are elements of that in the initial deal. But we're also concerned about migration going forward in relation to particular industry areas. For us, it's health and social care. Large numbers. We need something like 60,000 additional care workers in Scotland by 2022. There is no possibility of those jobs being found from the indigenous population. So migration is an important part, not just keeping those workers already here, but also encouraging additional people to come as well. So those are our concerns. We're also obviously concerned about the EU withdrawal bill and the impact on a range of protections which currently exist in European law, such as all the various workers' rights and other provisions in there, and obviously are concerned that there's a deregulation drive, certainly by the hardline Brexiteers who will wish to take advantage of that. So I think those are our areas. I think some of the areas of disagreement. Sorry, the other thing I need to mention is the trade bill. The UK trade bills come through. We've got Liam Fox trekking around the world trying to negotiate trade deals with anyone that will have us. And clearly that is a concern to us because trade bills these days are not about tariff barriers as they used to be. They're largely about deregulation. So, and you know, the European Union doesn't have a good track record on this. You know, we had a pretty major falling out, even with the left of centre MEPs over things like CETA and TTIP, and and so therefore it's a problem in Europe. It'll be a bigger problem with someone like Liam Fox having his hands on, and the trade bill gives them too many powers to be able to negotiate those sort of agreements. So I think generally, I think I suppose my overall pitch would be that I think Jeremy's position is probably a decent holding position for where we are at present. I don't think it's necessarily the final position. I think some of the issues that we will have to deal with, certainly all the trade unions will not want trade barriers in the sense of either bureaucracy or in terms of tariffs, because that will have an impact on jobs. But equally, we have reservations about the single Europe, particularly in relation, in my case, a lot of work around procurement is a big issue. State aid has been an issue for Unison in terms of the single market, and a number of other areas. Obviously, free movement we have less of a problem with, but those are difficult areas for us with the single market. So it's by no means a perfect beast. I suspect the problem will come, is it possible to negotiate a deal which has, you know, many of the benefits of those trade arrangements, but don't come with the downside of those arrangements. The big one, of course, is also in relation to Jeremy's proposals around public ownership of utilities, railways and so on. Yes, of course, there are public operators right across Europe. We have one of them running the trains in Scotland, for example, which I think is bizarre, but there we go. So I think there are those arrangements, but I think what we know is that if you want to do that in Europe, you do it within a competitive framework. It's not about a monopoly, a state monopoly, essentially, and a social approach to the provision of those services. So I think that's our reservation about single market. I suspect the problem will be is, can we do a deal which keeps the benefits of trade, doesn't dislocate trading partners? Can we do that, and yet on the other hand, you know, get away from some of the worst aspects of the single market, so that we can do the radical things that we want to do as socialists, whereas at the same time to deal with some of the constraints that the single market has placed upon us. So I'll stop there in 18 minutes, and I'll do the next 2 hours later. Yeah.